Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're excited you're joining us tonight to hear more updates around how we're thinking about possibly shifting to a new budget model in DC public schools. We started this work before the pandemic, and you'll hear later tonight more about our key updates and how we're thinking about this. Before we introduce the Chancellor, I'd like my colleague and team member Jerry to share a few housekeeping updates. Jerry?
Perfect. Just to go over subtitles, if you need additional assistance with interpretation, we do have a Spanish Zoom for Spanish-speaking families, and you can go ahead, log on to bit.ly/DCPS Espanol if you need Spanish interpretation. And then for subtitles, if you go into your lower right screen, we have a gear button that you can press, choose captions and subtitles, and we have access to 6 subtitles: English, Chinese, Vietnamese, French, Spanish, and I believe those are all of them. And then for our next portion is how to communicate with us is in this show Q&A. So in the Q&A box, we have the entire budget team helping us to answer as many questions as we can throughout this entire town hall. And so in order to participate with us, please submit your questions or comments through the Q&A, and we'll try to answer your questions as best as possible throughout this entire time. And you can go ahead, choose to ask anonymously, or go ahead, use a name if you want us to get back to you throughout this presentation. And I will turn it over to Shanita.
Thanks so much, Jerry. Before I turn it over to the Chancellor, I want to mention what we're going to be covering for this evening. So you'll see the agenda here on the screen. First, we're going to kick off with hearing from the Chancellor with, of course, a welcome, and then hearing an overview of these new budget model considerations that we're considering. You'll hear from some of our colleagues that lead our Budget and Finance Office with a reminder of where we've been, along with some key updates. And from there, we're going to have an opportunity to take some questions live and talk about next steps. So I want to echo one of the things that Jerry just shared with you, and that's how we're going to manage the chat in the live Q&A. So we anticipate lots of questions when we have meetings like this, and lots of questions and comments come in. And so there's a team of staff that are working behind the scenes here who will do their best to answer and address the comments that come up in the chat box. But we typically are not able to get to everything. We try to look at what themes are popping up and questions that are common and coming up frequently, and make sure that we're answering those first and foremost. We'll also take a few questions live tonight too. So we just ask for your patience and understand that we will do our absolute best to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. From there, I want to introduce the Chancellor, Chancellor Louis Fairby, to welcome us here tonight and share some opening remarks. Chancellor?
Thank you, Shanita. Thank you, Jerry. It's a great opportunity for me to be with you tonight to be responsive to the call for greater equity, sustainability, and transparency in how we allocate dollars to schools and our budget model. As we mentioned to you before, we started this work pre-pandemic, and we were deep into the strategy planning in the days before COVID-19. We paused the work to ensure that we were responsive to the needs of our students and families, but we are now recommitting ourselves to several key factors, and there's several reasons why we're doing that. One is we want to ensure that we continue our position as the fastest improving district in the nation. We also want to ensure that our students are not shortchanged and our schools have the resources they need now and years to come to support all of our students and families in their dreams and aspirations and to realize their full potential. A significant step for us is making sure that we are able to communicate to the public and to the community how we are incorporating your input and how the decisions about our budget are no longer opaque, top down, or perceived to be unfair. We know that there's been some dissatisfaction that's been expressed about our current comprehensive staffing model, which is how we currently allocate dollars to schools, which is why DCPS is exploring a different funding model. We know that this is a model that needs to be sustained over time, given the shift of resources. And again, there's an emphasis on the three areas noted here: equity, sustainability, and transparency. So go to the next slide. I do want to talk a little bit about what are the current benefits of the comprehensive staffing model and what we see as opportunities for growth. So we know that we've been able to invest more in our students and we are leading the nation in investments, but also we've seen academic growth, which allows us to outpace progress that we're seeing in other peer districts, particularly urban school districts. We know that we're spending more on our students who are impacted by poverty. And this is something that we've strategically prioritized. Given those bright spots, we still know that there's opportunity to refine and get better. And the growth opportunities are on the right-hand side of the slide, which includes our spending, ensuring that we are getting the most from our dollars and a return on investment, but also ensuring that we're varying for students' needs, that there are no longer any perceived inequities. And these inequities are most pronounced now at the secondary level. Also ensuring that we have a spending plan for our small schools and they have the resources to support their families, and then continue to elevate a lens of equity as we are also advancing transparency. We want families in the community clearly to see how dollars are being allocated to schools and why, and then what levers schools have as relates to their funding to bring about the best results for their student population. We go to the next slide. I just want to recap what we have been on as relates to this journey to a new budget model. This work has been very iterative and we've continued to get feedback and we continue to use that feedback to build new ways of thinking. We know that our success hinges on a degree of our authentic engagement and also ensuring that there's diversity in voices and perspectives that we hear from. As a result, we've had a principal budget task force. We've also had a policy task force. Both of these groups have been very helpful in giving us insight of where we should go next. The principal budget task force has created a very diverse representation across all 8 wards and school types. And then our policy members included external experts and also some of our fierce advocates around finance. We are also steeped in the immediacy of responding to the public health emergency. So we know that there's a balance between where we are today, our strong recovery as we go into this school year, and then thinking beyond the 21-22 school year. As we think about where we are, we also want to ensure that we were able to engage again. We know that the engagement was limited over the last school year in spring, and so we hope that this will allow us to get back and recommit and spend time with you to think about how we redesign our budget model in this critical path forward in a time where we need to build back stronger over the next couple of months, and then also giving ourselves a longer runway to do the analysis and the engagement needed to produce a strong budget model. I am extremely grateful for your feedback and you joining us, and we look forward to more conversation after tonight over the next couple of months. And as the Chancellor of DC Public Schools, I want you to know that we want to hear from you. And we've already heard that loudly and clearly that there's a need to ensure that there's greater equity and transparency in how we allocate dollars to schools. And this is a priority. Which is why we are open to and will continue to hear your voices, but also know that we must remain focused on closing our opportunity gaps across the district in all 8 of our wards. So as we go to the next slide, I do want to ensure that you know that, again, we're recommitting. We know that while we had a pause, that this is important work for us to pursue at this moment. As we think specifically about equity, I also want you to know that we want to ensure that the new model helps our school leaders make the best decisions, that they're adaptive, they're nimble, so we can continue to build back stronger than before. So we believe that this is a critical time to take this step as we're rebuilding from the health emergency, and this will allow our schools to adapt accordingly and meet students where they are. And we also know that this shift is critical as we think about the next phase of our strategic priorities and our capital commitment. So expect us to think about sustainability, expect us to think about the upcoming tighter economic forecasts after the recovery period that we're in right now, when all the stimulus dollars are gone and all the ESSER funding is gone. You know, how we will sustain a functional model that supports schools is important. And we know that we must evolve beyond the current comprehensive staffing model. So again, thank you for joining us this evening. We appreciate your engagement and interest in this topic. It's my pleasure now to turn it over to Kevin Wenzel, who's on our finance team. Kevin will provide more details on where we've been and where we're going. So please join me in welcoming Kevin Wenzel, our Deputy Chief of Finance.
Thank you, Chancellor. Very excited to remind everyone of what we've heard in our previous engagement. So if we could go to the next slide. So we're going to move into our public feedback and results slide to hear about our previous engagement on this work. On the next slide, you'll see some quick stats about our survey. First, public input for this. The public input website was open from August 8th to September 4th of last year. And in addition to videos on DCPS's process for developing a next generation budget model, the survey also included 6 content-specific questions and 1 prompt on final comments or questions. And as you can see from this slide, the survey received over 3,000 views, and DCPS budget staff read through all 499 comments. And in that feedback, we received a mix of parent, community member, staff, and student responses, and we're happy to see that all wards were represented. On the next slide, we received a large volume of very thoughtful and comprehensive comments and feedback. And today we won't be able to address all the comments, but I do want to assure you that the budget and engagement teams have read through every comment. Today we're going to focus on 4 themes. First, our purpose and objective with this work. Second, our transparency objective with this work. Next, how allocations will address need. And finally, what this will mean for schools. So first, on this first theme, many people in those responses wanted to better understand the specific problems we are trying to solve, as well as learn what we are defining as success and how we will measure it. So you see some sample quotes here. On the second theme, on the next slide, we heard an overwhelming desire for increased transparency in 2 ways. First, DCPS's overall budget process and how DCPS receives funds. And second, DCPS's decisions on how schools receive their funds. A third theme on the next slide, we heard feedback that we need to better communicate the differences in a staffing versus a student-based model. But at the same time, and we'll see some more information on this in a couple slides later, the majority agreed that a model that allocates both via student need and staffing is most adaptive. So there was consensus that resources should go to the students that need it most, meaning dollars follow the student need. And when we asked about key programs or staffing that is most essential, we heard a variety of individual and community priorities. And that confirms and aligns with our belief that no school is the same, and school leaders and communities need to be able to make the best resource decision for their students. A final theme, many of you wanted to know what this will mean for specific schools, especially our small schools. We share this concern and will be sharing various policies to check for sufficiency and stability that we are exploring both today and in future engagements. We heard that there's a desire for more clarity around these two different model design choices. Again, the majority of responses supported a combination model. Many of you shared support of student-based budgeting in order to have the dollars follow students and to provide programming and resources they need to succeed, but there was concern about its impact on smaller schools, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So that was looking back at our prior feedback. Next, I'd like to provide some key updates on opportunities for this model that we are exploring. So first, I do want to acknowledge, as the Chancellor did, that as COVID and the revenue environment may change, our priorities and values remain the same. I hope to share them and revoice them here. To uphold and improve equity, we would want a new model that allocates the majority of dollars via individual student needs. To achieve stability and sustainability, we'd want the new model to ensure that sufficient baseline staff and supplies are in place so all schools can succeed. And at the same time, stabilization policy protecting schools from decreases of more than 5% should be maintained. And then finally, to improve transparency, we would seek to provide easily accessible DCPS finance information online, focusing both on how the budget process works and how dollars are allocated. So let's look at some key differences between the two models that we put forth that we are exploring. Both our current model, which is to the left, the comprehensive staffing model, and then the other considerations for a student-based model. So on the comprehensive staffing model, folks will be familiar that this allocates staff based on your student counts, your enrollment. This budgets funds for programs instead of specific student needs for the most part, and it may limit flexibilities at the school level, be more centrally driven as a model. When you look on the right side, the student-based budgeting idea, this would allocate dollars based on student need, student attributes, sometimes can be more simple, more transparent, and have different flexibilities for customizing at the school level. But the concern that we shared earlier and that we heard via our feedback was small schools may find it challenging to offer a comprehensive baseline of services or programming. So what we're exploring is considering a combination model where we would allocate some resources as staff and others as dollars per student. And we'll take a look at some of those details of allocation methodologies on the next slide. So the new model we're exploring would be more of a blended model. This would distribute resources to the school in several ways. You see 4 different ways detailed here that we're considering. First is this student-based funds bucket. This would be dollar allocations based on student need and demographics, where dollars would follow the students based on their need. This would help to promote equity and transparency, which of course were 2 of our objectives with this work in the first place. This second group is staffing ratios. This is similar to our existing comprehensive staffing model where staff are allocated based on enrollment. And this would make sure that essential services like special education resources, English language learner resources are adequately and equitably resourced at schools. The third group would be our program grants. This would be specific or specialty programs or grants that could afford opportunities for schools for supplemental allocations for high student needs. And then this final group would be stability funds. This would be to make sure that we have mechanisms built within the model where we would have, even despite year-to-year enrollment changes, could consider not large fluctuations for unique demographic and programming needs. So we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into each of these allocation models that we're considering. First, on that first group, how would a student-based funding system work? Again, this is with dollars allocated through this method to follow students based on need. So first, you'll see on this slide, there would be a base weight for each student. This would be the same amount in that light blue box. And then there are additional supplemental weights that provide additional funds to students based on their unique characteristics, such as a student who is learning English or a student who might have special education needs. Importantly, students would get all of the weights associated with their unique mix of characteristics. So as you can see here with Ella on the left and Mark on the right, Mark has special education needs as well as English language learner needs, and therefore has those additional weights, whereas Ella does not have those needs and does not have those additional weights. Moving to the next group of allocation methods that we're considering, the staffing ratios, we'll take a look at what some examples of that might include, and program grants, we'll take a look at some examples of what that may include. First, let's take a look at staffing ratios on the next slide. So this is similar to how we, in the comprehensive staffing model, allocate resources. This could include a principal, your custodial services staff, your other kinds of specialty staff like early childhood, English language learner resources, special education resources, and social, emotional, and mental health. On the program grant side, this would include some of our federal support, so that's what is meant by this Title I and Title II call out here, as well as our at-risk funding. Could also include CTE, career and technical education, after-school programming, and other kinds of specialty programs, such as NAF academies and International Baccalaureate. And the final group, the last way we're considering allocating funds is to provide stabilization funds to schools. There's two ways we're considering doing that. The first one on the left is what we're calling a safety net. This is very closely related to the student-based funds bucket, where we're going to run a check to ensure that a school, based on what they are generating from their student-based funds, that they are able to provide a baseline of services. If they're not able to do that, then we would bring them up via the safety net mechanism. On the right is a stabilization funding that some on the call may be familiar with. This is the code mandated idea that no school would fall below 5% of their prior year's allocation. Okay, and we're going to move in this next part onto some questions and next steps. On the next slide, before we jump into questions, I wanted to provide a timeline of where we are and our next steps. So during September and October, we'll continue to engage stakeholders and the public on this new proposed consideration for a budget model. November and December, we'll finalize some budget decisions and share information with stakeholders and the public. And then finally, in December and January, budget formulation begins for school year 2022-23. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Shanita with our question and answer section.
Great, thank you, Kevin. I think what we'll do during this section is lift up a few of the, I think all of the questions that have come in through the Q&A we have posted and responded to in the chat box. I'm going to lift up a couple just in case there are folks that are joining that are not able to access or view this chat box. So for those who are able to view it and are going to listen to a voiceover, we apologize in advance if it's duplicative. I also want to just introduce or share with you that I'll be bringing on another team member, another colleague that works with Kevin. Her name is Sharon Gaskins, and she is our officer for our school resource office. And so she'll be supporting answering some of these questions as well. So one of the questions that came up here is around Dr. Carrie Thompson asks how DCPS is supporting virtual learning in the event that another forced remote learning, virtual learning occurs. And more specifically with this question, what ways have we prepared to address the digital divide that some families face? There's a response in the chat, but Kevin or Sharon, are you able to voice over just a little bit more from what's shared there with those who can't view the chat?
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to respond to that question. So yes, we are working really hard to make sure that we're able to operate in a manner that best supports our students in response to whatever our context will bring. What we have been really, we've really refined and learned through this year, along with our school communities and families, is the need for our educators to be supported, for strong communications to be in place with our families and communities, the important role of technology, which we continue to focus on along the way. So I do think there's also opportunities through our stimulus funding to really double down in areas that we started to make critical investments in. And so overall, I do think we are having that perspective in mind as we enter this really critically important school year for our students and families.
Great, thank you so much, Sharon. There's another question that's come in and that wants some additional clarification. Can we clarify, will school year 22-23 school budgets definitely be based on the new budget model?
I'm happy to take that one as well. I think the really important framing that I'd want to reground ourselves in is that we are exploring this work. We are putting forward in this conversation the key considerations that we are looking at based on best practices from other districts, based on our knowledge of our current system. And so this is part of the iterative process that the Chancellor shared at the beginning of this meeting, is to engage and hear from you and our other stakeholders, including our principals, school leaders. And so we are deeply committed to having that space and time to have these conversations and explore what this could mean for DCPS in the upcoming budget season.
Great. I'm looking in the chat to see what else is coming through. Let's see. I'm sorry, bear with me 1 second. Can you talk, there was a question about asking about the role, additional engagement that will happen, and made me think about the important role that LSATs play, local school advisory teams. Kevin or Sharon, will that role shift or change in terms of expectations for LSATs or continued engagement on this anticipated new budget model?
I'm happy to take that too, and we'll please ask Kevin to layer on for anything I've missed. We are really excited to continue to support our schools to engage in that LSAT process. Right now, we have a laser-like focus in supporting our principals to become ambassadors. So everything you hear, they hear and have an opportunity to ask questions, really dig deeply. And through upcoming engagements in the fall, we'd want the same for the broader community. So absolutely, we'd want our LSATs to similarly be empowered and engaged and knowledgeable about what this, where we land, what that shift would look like, what it would mean for their schools, and really have an opportunity to fully engage along the way. And that's actually, I should say, an area where me and several members of our team are really excited about continuing this work. So.
Great. So I'm going to throw this question to Kevin, and maybe Sharon, you can layer on here. There's a question that's coming up about protections or fail-safes that we'll put in place through a new budget model that will ensure that schools, in particular east of the river, and certainly as we think about smaller schools, will be protected. How are we thinking about equity as a core principle as we think about this budget process?
Yeah, thanks, Shanita. I can take that. I think I shared a little bit of detail about how we're thinking about stability from the school's experience in that last group of funds that we're planning or thinking about for this to include in a potential model. And I think you hit the nail on the head with the question too, that equity is a core principle of the work that as we move forward with it. And so all of the outcomes and funding outcomes that would come about from any final model, we would consider along that lens. And Sharon, I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to share there.
No, sounds right to me.
Great. And I think we may have talked about this. I might have missed it because I was looking in the chat box. But as we think about sharing this moving forward, as we get closer to thinking about different budget models and sharing projections across multiple years by schools, can you talk a little bit about what that will look like moving forward? When can folks expect to see more of that information?
Yeah, happy to respond to that. So where we are is still, again, in that iterative process, determining what makes sense for DCPS in our schools at this time. We would expect that during the fall, when our budget season begins, it's the time where we have a much clearer picture about issues like enrollment, budget projections, and the like, where we will be able to much better forecast for fiscal year 23 what a shift that we're contemplating and working towards would look like and mean for schools. And so that's a very long way of saying we would plan to engage over the course of our upcoming budget cycle and share as much as we can as schools, LSATs, parents engage and look forward to the next school year, 22-23.
Great. The question keeps coming up, and I know this is something that lots of folks wonder. When we talk about small schools, what do we mean when we say that?
Sure, I can say just as a concept, they are in DC, we have schools at each kind of grade band, and there are some that are at a certain, there's a range in DC, and there's some schools at each grade range and grade band that are smaller than peer schools. And so when we think about small schools compared to medium or larger schools, I think that's often in terms of the budget, thinking about how do we support them? How do we make sure that they're able to provide rigorous, high quality programming? Because certainly we don't want to disadvantage our children, our students in smaller schools. We think they are special places where relationships can be strong, and places where we want to, of course, lift up and support student learning. And so in the context of this conversation, we want to make sure that all of our schools are supported and all of our students have the resources they need to be successful, no matter what size school they attend.
Great. All right, so Kevin, as we think about a new model, will it make it easier to understand how school allocations are calculated? We know that this is something that Sometimes folks get frustrated with us in terms of the level of transparency in terms of being able to see this by school. So will this make it easier to do that?
Yeah, thanks, Shanita. I think, as we said, transparency is going to be a key principle of this work, and the new model we're exploring would ensure that communities are better able to understand how funds are allocated. Of course, with a focus on ensuring that the funding follows the student, and that's clear for communities as they're exploring their budget formulation.
Great. Let's see. I know that folks are asking questions about, and I think, you know, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but want to raise it again. As we think about folks wanting to see comparisons, so being able to assess a new model and how this would affect their school based on sort of last year's budget or year-over-year budget, and really be able to compare and see where how it would shift, what their budget looks like. Will we be giving folks an opportunity to take a look at that, and what would that process look like?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. So I think what I would focus on is there is definitely a desire for school communities to compare year over year, where the budgets might increase or decrease, and certainly as we develop and figure out where the path forward is for this new model, LSATs and school communities will be able to understand what's changed. So the CSM, as it's currently structured, will be different, right? We will not fund schools potentially if we use what we presented here today as like a combination model. And so what we'll want to empower school leaders and school communities to do is understand that shift. We think it's a shift towards equity. That means students getting what they need, and we know it's a shift. We would aim for a shift towards transparency, but it would be our goal for school communities to be able to understand why that shift happened. Is it and to be able to really engage with what the model looks like and how it's different than the comprehensive staffing model. And again, that's part of the reason why we are talking with folks today and engaging across many stakeholder groups, because we think it's our job to help connect those dots, and we want to be able to do that well.
Great. Excellent. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat that we haven't already answered. And so I'll talk a little slow, unless in case folks that are logged in want to put in a couple of extra questions here that pop up. For now, I am going to go to the next slide and just share a little bit in terms of next steps and where you can find some additional information. Certainly look out for more information coming this fall. We'll have another similar town hall here with additional information that reflects our thinking further at that point. We will continue to connect with, and Kevin mentioned this at the top, with our some of our stakeholders that we have been meeting with a few times over the summer, and make sure that we're continuing to collect as much feedback at this point as possible. But you can expect a fuller and more robust calendar of activities, engagement activities to come in the coming weeks. And so look out for that, because there will be opportunities for folks to learn more and to dig in more at the school level, especially with our LSATs. Feel free to go on and check out dcpsbudget.com for additional information on current school budgets. And then, of course, for any additional questions that we did not answer tonight or that come up for you or that some of your peers raise that you want to make sure get answered, feel free to send an email to dcps.schoolfunding@k12.dc.gov. And as always, as it relates to all things reopening, visit dcpsreopenstrong.com to access additional resources on back to school. This past Tuesday, we held a parent university on what to expect when returning back to school. That video is on our YouTube site, and I believe we have put the link in the chat. And so you can go there and find out more information. All right, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate you. Have a good evening, have a good weekend, and we'll see you in the coming weeks and certainly in the fall with more information. Have a great school year.